has Iran's regime finally reached a breaking point. On the 12th day of nationwide unrest, Iranian cities are experiencing an unprecedented surge of anti-government demonstrations that have quickly spread from Tehran to smaller towns across the country. Public squares, once dominated by official flags and state symbols, are now filled with tens of thousands of citizens chanting slogans of defiance and brandishing banners calling for an end to Ayatollah Khamenei's rule. Videos circulating on social media show women and men faces bloodied but determined confronting armored police units with nothing more than rocks and homemade shields. This grassroots decentralized movement is increasingly difficult for security forces to contain, suggesting the regime's grip on power is weakening. The scale of the protests is startling. Analysts estimate that participation may have reached a critical 4% of the population, approximately 3.5 million people, an internationally recognized threshold for triggering systemic instability in authoritarian regimes. Political scientist Dr. Emily Harrington of the London School of Economics notes, "Even modest percentages in a highly repressive state can snowball quickly when momentum builds and local towns coordinate effectively." The widespread engagement across multiple urban centers, including Iran's industrial hubs and transport corridors, underscores the strategic significance of these protests. Control over these areas is crucial, not just symbolically, but economically affecting supply chains and energy distribution. Footage from Mashhad, Iran's second-largest city, shows protesters dismantling the Islamic Republic's flag in the main square and setting fire to buses once operated by IRGC paramilitary forces. In Karachi, another major industrial city west of Tehran, demonstrators have reportedly forced security units to retreat in multiple districts, illustrating the growing vulnerability of the regime's traditional power centers. Experts point out that the geographic dispersion of the uprising complicates the state's response, especially when communication networks are partially disrupted or decentralized. Western intelligence assessments suggest that Iran's security apparatus is now stretched thin, with localized clashes overwhelming conventional crowd control strategies. Adding to the complexity, the international community has been watching closely. The United States, under President Donald Trump, has publicly warned that continued violence against civilians could trigger direct consequences, signaling a potential readiness for targeted intervention, whether through sanctions, intelligence support, or precision operations. NATO officials have been quietly assessing the regional implications, emphasizing that instability in Iran could disrupt global energy markets, affect security in the Persian Gulf, and force rapid contingency planning across allied forces. Moreover, analysts highlight parallels with Ukraine's energy attacks on Russian infrastructure, noting that irregular small-unit high-impact tactics can have outsized strategic effects, a lesson not lost on both Iranian protesters and Western observers. A critical question now emerges for viewers: how far will the protests spread, and which cities will tip the balance against the regime? Meanwhile, while demonstrators seize symbolic and strategic locations, the regime contemplates an unprecedented nationwide internet blackout, a move that could either stifle coordination or ignite further defiance. What followed next shocked analysts. Could improvised weapons really challenge a state's elite forces? In multiple Iranian cities, protesters have effectively turned the tide against armed security units. Footage emerging from Mashhad, Karachi, and Sahar shows civilians wielding rocks, sticks, and Molotov cocktails as security personnel retreat from neighborhoods they once patrolled with confidence. In Sahar, shocking recordings reveal the targeted assassination of a police commander in broad daylight, a rare instance of direct action against regime leadership by non-military actors. While such acts are extraordinary, they underscore the severe vulnerabilities of the Iranian state apparatus in the face of sustained, decentralized unrest. Western defense analysts describe this as a classic asymmetric urban uprising, where lightly armed but highly motivated civilians exploit gaps in conventional forces. Professor Daniel Kavanagh of the Royal United Services Institute explains, when public unrest reaches this scale, even elite paramilitary forces can be overwhelmed. The key is momentum and the psychological impact of witnessing authority crumble in real time. The retreat of IRGC units in multiple districts has emboldened local populations, creating a feedback loop where more towns join the protests, further straining the regime's capacity to maintain control. This dynamic is reminiscent of Ukraine's recent operations against Russian energy infrastructure, where small, coordinated strikes caused disproportionate disruption. Experts note that the psychological effect on defenders is as critical as the physical damage. Morale collapses faster than lines of defense. Analysts from Military Watch magazine highlight that similar patterns are emerging in Iran, with security forces unable to secure key industrial zones. Protests threaten to cut off supply lines, energy distribution, and critical transportation, thereby amplifying the economic impact of the uprising. Reports indicate that in Karach, Iran's third-largest city, local citizens have forced security checkpoints to fall back entirely, leaving major transit arteries open and effectively liberating entire districts. Meanwhile, in smaller towns, even unarmed civilians are maintaining control of key intersections, forcing the regime to commit disproportionate resources to areas of secondary strategic importance. Intelligence briefings suggest that the Iranian leadership is alarmed by the rapid collapse of local command and control structures, with some units reportedly refusing orders, a sign of internal fractures. The international community is observing these developments with growing concern. NATO intelligence circles are examining the potential for cascading instability, noting that widespread defections within local forces could create an opening for external actors to apply strategic pressure without committing ground troops. In Washington, senior officials have indicated that President Trump is prepared to support civilian protection operations, potentially mirroring low-footprint strategies previously used in Libya and Venezuela, emphasizing precision strikes and intelligence rather than conventional military engagement. Viewers are left to consider, can ordinary citizens sustain this momentum long enough to truly challenge entrenched authority? Yet, as security forces withdraw and citizens gain territory, the regime is reportedly preparing harsher countermeasures, signaling that the next phase could escalate into a high-stakes confrontation. What followed next stunned global analysts. What happens when a population starts dismantling the very symbols of state power? Across Iran, protesters have shifted from street demonstrations to targeting emblematic structures representing the regime's authority. In Mahsad, crowds tore down the Islamic Republic's flag in the city center, while in Karach, footage shows a bus belonging to the IRGC's paramilitary units set ablaze. Religious schools, often seen as instruments of ideological indoctrination, were also attacked, igniting debates about the cultural as well as political dimensions of the uprising. Analysts argue that the destruction of these symbolic targets is not merely expressive, it carries tangible strategic weight, undermining regime legitimacy and emboldening opposition in both urban and rural areas. The psychological impact is profound. Professor Rebecca Alston of Georgetown University notes, when citizens begin dismantling state symbols, it signals a breakdown in authority perception. Even if the state retains military power, its legitimacy erodes rapidly in the public eye. Videos of these actions circulating on social media amplify their effect, drawing international attention and inspiring further participation in other cities. In some cases, statues of commanders previously revered by the regime, such as Hossein Soleimani, have been toppled, a reversal of public sentiment that reflects both historical grievances and present anger. This mirrors recent trends in Ukraine, where symbolic attacks on energy and infrastructure serve both practical disruption and morale-shaping functions. Economic analysts warn that the destruction of industrial and transport-linked structures could exacerbate Iran's existing financial strain. Karach, a vital transport hub connecting Tehran to the Caspian region, has seen districts liberated by protesters, leaving critical supply lines exposed. Reports indicate that factories and warehouses have been temporarily abandoned, and energy distribution centers are at risk. In combination, these disruptions threaten to paralyze regional commerce, forcing the regime to decide between rapid military intervention or calculated concessions. Western experts emphasize the strategic implications of symbolic attacks on national morale. NATO officials in Brussels have been monitoring Iran's urban uprisings, closely acknowledging that while these protests are domestic, the economic ripple effects could reach Europe via energy markets. Daniel Hughes, a former NATO intelligence officer, explains even a temporary loss of control over a key industrial city in Iran sends shockwaves internationally. The perception of instability is almost as consequential as the physical destruction. U.S. policymakers under President Trump are weighing options for supporting civilian resilience, including intelligence sharing and satellite-based communications, to prevent mass casualties and to maintain global stability. A critical question emerges for audiences. How much damage can symbolic acts inflict on both the regime's authority and its operational capabilities before it resorts to full-scale retaliation? Meanwhile, as protesters focus on emblematic structures, cracks within the regime itself are widening, with whispers of defections and dissent among the clerical and security hierarchy. What followed next began reshaping the political landscape in unexpected ways. Could the very guardians of Iran's theocracy be turning against it? In an unprecedented development, some clerics and religious leaders have publicly voiced support for protesters, calling for reforms and, in rare cases, the overthrow of Ayatollah Khamenei. Video clips circulating online show statements from dissident clerics urging the population to maintain pressure and defend neighborhoods against IRGC units. This internal dissent signals a deeper fracture within Iran's power structure, one that could accelerate the regime's erosion of control. Intelligence sources indicate that certain mid-level commanders in security forces are quietly defying orders, refusing to carry out aggressive crowd control measures against demonstrators, further weakening the regime's operational effectiveness. Western analysts emphasize the significance of internal defections. Dr. Marcus Levitt, a senior fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, notes, when parts of the security apparatus hesitate or openly resist orders, it can trigger a cascade effect. The perception of regime vulnerability emboldens civilians and creates uncertainty among loyalist forces. The parallels with Ukraine's ongoing attacks on Russian energy infrastructure are notable. Just as small coordinated strikes exploited weaknesses in Russia's defenses, decentralized civilian uprisings in Iran are now challenging the centralized authority of a seemingly monolithic theocracy. Reports from intelligence briefings suggest that internal splits are most pronounced in urban centers, where protests have gained territorial control. Cities like Karach and Mahasad are becoming not only symbolic victories, but operational hubs where coordination between protesters and sympathetic insiders in the security forces is occurring. This raises a critical concern for NATO and Western planners. If Iran's internal security apparatus cannot contain civil unrest, there may be opportunities and risks for external powers to exert influence, particularly in safeguarding energy routes, regional stability, and citizen protections. The strategic calculus is further complicated by the United States under President Trump, which has publicly warned of potential intervention should civilian casualties escalate. Analysts highlight that even without boots on the ground, U.S. intelligence and precision operations could shift the dynamics significantly. Leveraging satellite reconnaissance, electronic monitoring, and targeted sanctions to pressure regime hardliners. Israeli intelligence is also reportedly observing these developments, given Iran's regional influence and history of proxy operations. The combination of internal dissent, civilian momentum, and potential Western pressure creates a volatile, high-stakes scenario for Tehran. For viewers, the key question becomes, how far will these defections extend, and could they tip the balance enough to force the regime into concessions or collapse? Yet while internal fractures grow, Iran's leadership is contemplating drastic countermeasures, including nationwide internet restrictions that could either slow coordination or further ignite public defiance. What followed next caught global analysts off guard. Can satellite internet tip the balance in a nation under siege? As the Iranian regime contemplates an unprecedented nationwide internet blackout, protesters are increasingly relying on Starlink and other satellite-based networks to coordinate and document their activities. Thousands of smuggled terminals have provided civilians with independent communication channels, circumventing the state's traditional control over information. Videos showing live clashes, burned government symbols, and liberated neighborhoods continue to flood social media, amplifying the psychological impact and attracting global attention. Analysts note that this technological resilience not only sustains morale, but also challenges the regime's ability to enforce a total information blackout. The strategic implications of this technological edge are profound. Experts from the Center for Strategic and International Studies highlight that Iran's leadership now faces a dilemma: enforce a brutal suppression and risk international backlash, or concede ground to protesters, potentially emboldening further dissent. The United States, under President Trump, has already issued stern warnings against civilian killings, signaling that any large-scale crackdown could trigger punitive responses. While direct military involvement is unlikely, precision intelligence, satellite surveillance, and targeted sanctions are on the table as tools to shape outcomes without committing ground forces. This mirrors previous low-footprint interventions in Venezuela and Libya, where U.S. and allied support for civilian actors altered the strategic balance without full-scale occupation. Energy and economic vulnerabilities compound the challenge for the regime. With protests spreading to industrial hubs and major transport corridors, Iran faces disruptions to oil production, gas distribution, and key logistics. Analysts draw parallels to Ukraine's drone and missile attacks on Russian energy infrastructure, noting that relatively small targeted actions can have outsized strategic consequences. In Iran, liberated districts not only serve as protest strongholds, but also as leverage points in the broader economic struggle. NATO observers have expressed concern that ongoing instability could ripple through global energy markets, particularly affecting Europe's oil and gas supplies, and may prompt contingency planning among Western allies. For citizens on the ground, the stakes are existential. Western military analysts emphasize that information access is as critical as physical control. The ability to document abuses, coordinate safe zones, and communicate across dispersed cells amplifies civilian agency. Dr. Laura Chen of the Atlantic Council notes, technology becomes a force multiplier. Starlink terminals, encrypted communications, and international media coverage enable a movement to punch above its weight, challenging the assumption that only armed forces can shape outcomes. A pressing question emerges for viewers. Will technological resilience and international attention be sufficient to force concessions, or will the regime respond with more extreme measures? Meanwhile, even as protesters gain communication and tactical advantages, Tehran appears ready to escalate, testing both civilian endurance and international patience. What followed next revealed the full gravity of the regime's strategic calculations. What comes next? When a regime faces simultaneous internal revolt and international scrutiny, the Iranian leadership now confronts a precarious strategic dilemma: respond with overwhelming force, risking global condemnation, or negotiate and risk appearing weak to both citizens and hardliners. Western analysts highlight that Tehran's options are constrained. A nationwide crackdown could prompt U.S. precision operations or targeted sanctions, while continued internal defections and civilian control of key districts further limit the regime's ability to act decisively. Observers from Defense News note Iran is trapped between maintaining authority and avoiding strategic overreach. Every violent response increases the risk of international consequences and potential escalation. Internally, the fragmentation of security forces and the overt support of clerics for protesters are eroding the Ayatollah's legitimacy. In Karak and Mahasad city centers under civilian control provide not only symbolic victories, but operational leverage threatening supply chains and regional stability. Experts warn that if Iran's industrial hubs and energy corridors remain contested, the economic and logistical impact will ripple globally, potentially affecting NATO member states dependent on oil and gas imports. This scenario mirrors recent Ukrainian tactics against Russian infrastructure, where relatively small-scale actions produce disproportionately large strategic effects. The United States, led by President Trump, is actively signaling that further civilian casualties could provoke targeted responses. NATO intelligence confirms ongoing monitoring of urban hotspots, emphasizing that the instability may force Allied recalibration in the Middle East. Analysts suggest that Western powers are prepared to leverage advanced surveillance cyber tools and diplomatic pressure, aiming to protect civilians while deterring regime overreach. Israeli strategic planners are also watching closely given the regime's regional influence and history of proxy operations. For audiences, the central question is clear: will Tehran escalate into a full-scale violent crackdown, or will civilian resilience and technological communication force concessions? The uncertainty heightens tensions across the region, as the regime's next move could trigger a cascade of strategic consequences for NATO, US, and the West. Yet even as external actors weigh intervention and internal dissent grows, Iran remains unpredictable, leaving the future of this uprising suspended between potential collapse and brutal suppression. What will unfold in the coming days will redefine the balance of power inside and beyond Iran. Over 12 days, Iran has witnessed unprecedented civil unrest as millions of citizens take to the streets to challenge the Ayatollah's rule. Protesters have overwhelmed security forces in major cities, toppled regime symbols, and attacked institutions perceived as instruments of oppression. Clerics and mid-level commanders have publicly and quietly supported these movements, exposing fractures within the theocracy. Technological resilience, particularly via satellite internet like Starlink, has allowed citizens to coordinate across liberated districts, despite potential blackouts, while international scrutiny under President Trump signals that violence against civilians could provoke targeted responses from the United States and allied powers. Looking ahead, the regime faces stark choices: escalate with force and risk international retaliation, or negotiate and risk losing legitimacy entirely. Strategic analysts warn that the ongoing unrest could disrupt Iran's industrial hubs and energy corridors, with potential ripple effects for NATO countries and global energy markets. As protesters maintain momentum, the combination of internal dissent, symbolic victories, and international attention creates a volatile environment that could reshape both domestic governance and regional geopolitics. For viewers, the question remains: will Iran's citizens succeed in forcing meaningful change, or will the regime regain control through calculated repression? How do you think the international community should respond if tensions continue to escalate? If you found this analysis insightful, Consider subscribing to stay updated on evolving events in Iran and global security developments.